This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. Today's episode pushes us to think creatively about how we can support young people to enter the world of work. And if you've never heard the term demand-led skilling, that's about to change because it's central to today's conversation. It's a strategy that just makes sense if we want to equip young people for the changing world of work. Essentially, it's about aligning the skills of our young people with the actual demands of the labor market, ensuring that the training they receive is relevant, practical, and directly linked to real job opportunities. The state plays a big role, of course, in terms of policy making, allocations of funding, and positioning state agencies, public employment programs, training facilities, and colleges to work strategically and synergistically. The private sector must be part of the conversation, and so does civil society. We know that NGOs are strategic partners in public employment programs like the Social Employment Fund, creating part-time work opportunities for our young people. These jobs are funded by the state, but facilitated by NGOs who provide training and support. In addition, NGO-led youth development programs have a strong focus on skills and training for employability and are well positioned to reduce youth vulnerability at community level. Today, I'm joined by DGMT's Innovation Director, Bridget Hanna, to talk about what industry, civil society, and the state can do to incorporate demand-led skilling into strategies to reduce youth unemployment and vulnerability. Bridget, for those who aren't familiar with your job profile, I want to break it down for our listeners. Essentially, you coordinate DGMT's portfolio of work focused on creating pathways to productivity for young people in this country. These are investments in development projects, big ideas, advocacy, and public employment programs, to name a few. I would say that this gives you a unique vantage point to think creatively about skills to work linkages. So I'm curious to learn about how your thinking has evolved since you joined DGMT when it comes to key strategies to reduce youth unemployment and vulnerability.
This is such a fascinating question that really got me thinking. So before I joined DGMT, I worked in youth development and education, and a lot of the focus was on a quality first work experience. And the focus of that particular program that I worked on for about 8 years was how do we support young people with work readiness skills focused on personal development and then honing out a quality first work experience. So thinking about what does the workplace look like and how do we support young people to thrive. The big shift for me in coming to DGMT, where I've been for the last 3 years, is thinking about two things. The first thing is about the idea of scale. So how are we supporting young people at scale to access first work opportunities and then to be able to remain in opportunity? And the second is thinking about the burden perhaps that has been put on a first work opportunity to cover the shortfall in skills that our basic education system has left young people with. And so this really has driven me to think about not just the soft skills around personal development, who am I in the world, and where am I going in the world? How do I envision my future opportunity? But to think about what are the hard technical skills that need to complement this idea that I might be in a great youth development program that makes me feel confident about myself and feel confident about my future life opportunities, exit that first work experience, and then realize that the labor market doesn't have a place for me because my technical skills don't match what the labor market requires. And I think that's been for me really a big aspect of my thinking in supporting young people to connect to opportunity.
That's really interesting. So you spoke about the gaps in the basic education department, but there are gaps in tertiary education as well, for instance, in the TVET colleges. How does that factor into your thinking?
So this is really the opportunity of the topic that we're discussing today, which is demand-led skilling. And the interesting sort of feature of demand-led skilling is that it doesn't just sit in the public education system. It sits in the many training centers across the country. And so when we talk about where are the gaps, I think the opportunity here is to think about not just where there are these gaps in the basic education and TVET colleges, but in how we might think about the sometimes less obvious training centres that are able to provide young people or students with skills opportunities that equip them for the labour market.
Skills training, or technical skills as you put it, is a phrase that we use a lot in the development sector. And we hear a lot in speeches by government officials, because the fact of the matter is that the state has channeled a significant amount of money and resources into establishing funding mechanisms and structures to support young people to learn new skills and to find work. Bridget, I want to better understand why these structures are not working as well as they should.
So government already provides a huge amount of funding into the skills landscape, whether it is through the NSFAS funding mechanism. What we know is that 70% of university students and 90% of TVET students access NSFAS in order to fund their studies. We also have the CETAs who fund training across a broad number of skills opportunities. We have the employment tax incentive, which actually sees private business being incentivized to recruit and support young people in their first work experience. The landscape of funding for skills training and those pathways are in place. However, what we struggle to see is how, one, these massive and well-funded opportunities translate for young people to be able to access skills training and then access the world of work thereafter. And two, the dysfunctionality of these funding mechanisms in themselves. And for example, what we saw in April was the disbanding of the NSFAS board. When the board gets disbanded, it throws into even brighter light the challenges that young people have faced in accessing their NSFAS funding, which drives them into risk-taking behavior. So the challenge with young people accessing these skills opportunities is that it's not necessarily an issue of that there's not funding for it. The issues sit behind understanding how these different pieces connect in order to provide a smoother transition for a young person navigating where do I begin, navigating an employer, how do I onboard a young person. And that's really one of the big pieces of work that we're trying to first identify where those opportunities or those challenges sit, then where the opportunity to solve for those challenges sit, in order to support both young people who are thinking about how they might envision their life opportunities differently, and then for the employers who may have a heart for thinking about where their role might sit, but don't know where to begin in terms of absorbing young people into the workplace.
Bridget, why are we talking specifically today about demand-led skilling, and who are the main players in demand-led skilling?
Historically, a lot of our focus has been on how do we support young people in their personal development, in understanding who they are in order to be able to access the world of skills and work. And this opportunity for or pushing us towards thinking about what are the hard skills required to be able to thrive in the world of work really has shifted our traditional focus to youth development and pushed my own focus on youth development, as I was mentioning earlier, to say, well, there are so many components to supporting young people on these pathways to the world of work. And the focus on demand-led skilling is predominantly being driven out of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, thinking about at a broad and national level, how do we support young people on these pathways? And I've found it very helpful to reflect on the 5 components that the PYEI has set up around demand-led skilling, to think about where are the industries where there is absorptive capacity, and then thinking about breaking down, well, what would the skills for that area of the market look like? So perhaps it's helpful to just run through the areas, which are the automotive industry, installation, repair and maintenance. And for example, under installation, repair and maintenance might be an opportunity to think about solar panels as a next layer of thinking about how do we think about electricity, how do we think about the just energy transition. The third is digital and technology, which includes global business services, which we often refer to as the call centers, and South Africa has been put on the map as one of the fastest growing centers for call centers in the world. The fourth is agriculture, and the fifth is social services, so thinking about the care sector is something that DGMT has thought a lot about. And what's super interesting is that the PYEI has actually developed work streams behind each of these skills areas. And as we dive deeper and deeper into understanding, first of all, what is the absorptive capacity, and then what skills would be needed to link young people to those sectors, we start realizing how complex it is to skill for something that is a moving target.
I think for the benefit of our listeners, it would be good to explain why you refer to this as a moving target.
So one example is thinking about call centers. We get a lot of feedback that South Africa is an incredibly fast-growing market for call centers. However, there are real infrastructural challenges in setting up call centers. For example, continued energy supply, fast-moving broadband, and these are infrastructural challenges that sit outside of our ability or the opportunity to create young people who are skilled for those work opportunities. And so in quantifying how many young people to skill in that business, you also have to be thinking about the broader infrastructural challenges facing South Africa. The next layer is how we drumming up demand for South Africa as a place to invest your business in.
Bridget, that's really useful to understand what the problem is, the lay of the land, and why we're talking about demand-led skilling. So we have mechanisms and structures as you've laid out. We have incentives, government plays a role. We know that the private sector has a role to play as well. It seems like the ingredients are all there for things to work. Why aren't they currently? What are the roadblocks?
So one of the critical challenges facing particularly accessing technical skills is it goes way beyond theory. So a critical aspect is both work integrated learning or workplace-based learning. So once you've finished your theory component, that you are able to go and practice the skill in the workplace. Another component is the trade test. So your trade test having to be done in an accredited space with access to correct equipment. And these sorts of hurdles come before you being able to get your certificate. And this is really where the wheels start to come off. First of all, the access to work integrated learning or workplace-based learning placements that are catering to whatever trade or technical skill that you have taken up, and that employer needing to be able to not just ensure that you are doing the work that you've been theoretically trained in, and this, for example, might be in carpentry. So you've learned the theory of being a carpenter, and now you're in the workplace and actually practicing the skill on a day-to-day. So the first thing is the employer being able to offer that space for you to practice the theory. Sitting underneath that are all the challenges of what we're faced with is being used. The term that's being used is a lack of employability, which is, are young people coming to work? Are young people feeling valued in the workspace? Are employers understanding the needs of a young person who may have come from a household where they never had a working adult to understand what the culture of work looks like? So there are a multitude of challenges facing if you are able to secure a workplace-based learning opportunity. How are we navigating that space so that it is dignifying for the young person and helpful for the employer that they would take on more of those? And then the other element is accredited trade facilities. So we have a massive challenge in South Africa with a lack of centres that are accredited to actually just give that sign-off that the young person does in fact now have those technical capabilities, whether it be in plumbing or carpentry or electrical skills, to do the job.
Bridget, are there examples of state-funded or civil society programs currently trying to address skills shortages in the growth sectors that you outlined in your previous response? And how are they designed to do just that?
There are exceptional examples of where I would say the most successful skills to work linkages are happening are where organizations have thought at a very local level, how are we responsive to where work may be or work may be created? So how do we not just respond to demand, but also how do we stimulate demand? And I think of a project in rural KZN where young people learned how to weld and weld big pipes, which is an incredibly specialized skill, and how because of the quality of the skills program and the thoughtfulness about their own personal development and what that next opportunity might look like, that young people have taken the welding skills and have started their own business making burglar bars for their local community. And I think if we think carefully and creatively around what demand-led skilling looks like, not just at those 5 high-level components that I mentioned, but think about how are we responsive at a local level, we can really start thinking about how are young people skilled for and to solve for the challenges that they are facing every day, but might not necessarily think that they are part of the solution for.
That sounds like an amazing story. So how can the private sector get behind strategies like these?
So perhaps even before thinking about the private sector specifically is the particular partnership and some of the really exciting partnerships we've seen where the public sector TVET, who might be struggling with the load that's been placed on their trade centre, or perhaps their trade centre is not functional at the moment, might partner with a community education training centre down the road in order to think about, first of all, how do we overcome the challenges of the workplace-based learning and trade test before certification. So already there are interesting partnerships, and I think if I think of an organization like the Catholic Institute of Education, who are driving advocacy towards in thinking about how do we even conceptualize that journey to certification. So there are these incredibly innovative and exciting and creative frontline implementation solutions to thinking about how we support young people. And then the next layer is how do we partner, back to the topic of the conversation is really where demand sits. And this might be a small enterprise in a town, or it might be these macro opportunities. For example, when we think about how we are preparing ourselves for the just energy transition and more sustainable energy sources. And then thinking about how do we challenge where business is and where the employers sit in understanding their role in both absorbing those young people, but not just waiting for the young people to knock on the door, but thinking about how they might also reach out. And this really is where DGMT and the youth portfolio are thinking about how do we find where those key levers or key opportunities are in order to be the most strategic in creating linkages where sometimes it might be right in front of us, but we just aren't getting the right people in the room, or we might just be focused on our bit of the puzzle, but can't quite think about how our bit connects with another bit.
Bridget, in the anecdote that you shared earlier about the welding initiative in rural KZN, gave us the sense that demand-led skilling can be quite localized, and there is a power in that. Do you want to talk about that in particular and how demand-led skilling as a strategy can meet local needs?
So this is perhaps one of our greatest opportunities, but also one of the biggest challenges. If we think of TVETs running a national curriculum over 50 colleges across the country, and thinking about if you offer shipbuilding, for example, it doesn't make sense to offer shipbuilding in internal South Africa, because the opportunity for a young person who has learned the theory of shipbuilding to be able to merge it with the practical opportunity of shipbuilding sitting on the coast puts so many challenges in their wake. But what this means is that even the TVET offering has to be catered to where these technical and vocational opportunities exist in the country. And I think just to try and wrap our head around what it means to train in technical and vocational and occupational skills sort of opens up the complexity of really having to think about, well, how do you skill for where the work is? In thinking about the broader landscape of where community education training centres and MPOs offering accredited skills in occupational and artisanal trades sit, it is really exciting to think about how these technical skills are able to solve for local opportunities, let's call it. I think of an example of a training center in Gauteng where young people were using their carpentry skills to make coffins, because historically what had happened is this was needing to be outsourced to artisans sitting far outside of their community. What is also really exciting is thinking about not just perhaps some of the more traditional artisanal skills, but also some of the emerging markets around, for example, cell phone repair, and how young people are able to set up small businesses on basic and, over time, more complex cell phone repair. And this has birthed a new area of demand-led skilling, which is called hot skills. And these are things that quickly translate young people from the skills opportunity into the earning realm. And for those of us concerned about the massive unemployment challenge facing young people and South Africa as a whole, any kind of skill that's able to quickly translate into the opportunity to earn some form of an income, but a decent wage, really excites us.
Okay, so what can civil society organizations, who are primarily the audience for this podcast, what can they do to support government-led strategies, on-demand-led skilling, as outlined in the PYEI, which you mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation?
One of the big complexities, or one of the complexities facing solving for youth unemployment, is that no one organization can do it all. And within a resource-constrained and highly competitive sector, we really have to be thinking together as cooperatives, really, in how we solve for this very nuanced, non-linear pathway of young people to be able to move from skills to work. And so I always think, if before we start a skills center or before we start offering skills, because it is the urge, given the massive need facing so many organizations based in communities, and seeing the massive requirement or need of young people to thinking about and exploring how they participate, is thinking about what's the piece of the puzzle that I'm able to best fulfill, and how might I take the baton from somebody else and hand the baton over to somebody else. And so certainly when we think about skills opportunities, we think about how are you not just offering a skill, but how are you thinking about how that skill pairs with creating an environment where a young person feels that they're able to envision their life opportunity differently, with then being able to pair that with where the first work experience might happen, that is a dignifying and positive work experience. Because what we also know is that one of the biggest predictors of continued work experience is getting the first work experience. And so when we pair these different parts of the puzzle together, we're going to see more and more young people, first of all, being able to access opportunity, but then be able to keep a grip on opportunity. So what we really have to be thinking about is not how do I do it all, but how do I create strong partnerships that create a more enabling environment, putting the young person at the center.
Bridget, what we do know is that having the skills that an employer is looking for will increase your employability. But it doesn't guarantee employment. There are other things that need to happen to address high levels of unemployment in our country. And so drawing from your experience working with different projects in the youth portfolio, what else needs to change to really put a dent in our unemployment statistics?
Unless we think about young people as heterogeneous and not as homogeneous, so thinking about the individual needs of each young person and the journey that they've walked, we are never going to fully grapple with understanding what the blocks to skills, the blocks to finding that first work opportunity. My goodness, in transporting yourself every day to that first work opportunity when you haven't yet been paid, we have to think about the ecosystem that sets a young person up for success. And this starts way before they start as a work seeker. This starts in the basic education system. How are we setting up the curriculum and the classroom to help a young person imagine what the possibilities might even be in the first place, and then think about every step of the way. It's not about an access to information issue. It's about how do I pair or partner with something that sparks interest in me or desire or passion, that when things get tough, I'm going to keep going and I'm going to keep going for it. We have to think about really the whole person and walking that journey with them every step of the way. And this idea that if I do falter, if I do step back, if I do become disinterested or slightly disconnected, that this doesn't become long-term disengagement. And so a lot of the organizations, particularly in civil society that we work with and our projects at DGMT, understand this. What we need to do is we need to find how we pair this deep interest and understanding of our personal and interpersonal life with the hard skills required to contribute where the economy needs us most. And I think it's this partnership and this understanding the other side of the fence that is going to give us the best chance of success. However, there's a broader enabling environment that we really have to advocate for at an infrastructural level, at a accountability of the mechanisms that have been put in place to both fund training and the institutions where students train. So again, there's a piece that civil society and business can hold, but there's a massive piece of accountability that we also need to drive in keeping government as well to holding up their end.
Bridget, for those development organizations that are listening to today's podcast, where can they learn more about demand-led skilling and how they can get involved? What should they be reading?
I've found the skills strategy that was released post-COVID, which was entitled Support for the South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. It sounds like a mouthful, but if you just type in skills strategy on Google, it'll come up. It's a document set out in 2022. It both lays out why we have to be thinking about demand-led skilling specifically as opposed to skills in general. And it also has an index of, well, what do we mean by demand-led skilling? So I mentioned the 5 components earlier, but this gets broken down into, okay, so when we talk about artisanal skills, what types of artisanal skills actually does the economy need? However, I think that the other thing that whether you know about demand-led skilling or you're involved in skills or not, if you're working in communities and you have ideas and you can see that creative spark, what we really need is imagination. Because a lot of the jobs that are going to be created don't yet exist. And if we think about, for example, the just energy transition and the number of opportunities that are going to come up in thinking about how we build a better world, a better future, a greener future, what we really need is the ability or the capacity to imagine. So to imagine how the skills for today skill for the jobs for tomorrow. And so if anything, what I urge anybody who has a creative inclination to think about is, once we have the skills in place, what are the possibilities of where young people could find the opportunity to exercise those skills in the world of work?
Thank you, Bridget. I think that was a very useful way to end today's conversation. To those listening, I hope that our conversation has given you a deeper understanding of the role demand-led skilling plays in dealing with youth unemployment in our country. It's clear that aligning our training programs with the actual needs of the labour market is essential, not just for creating jobs, but for building sustainable careers that can uplift our communities and build a sustainable, greener, and better future for us all. And now over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. In the work that you or your organization does, is there an opportunity to support young people to access workplace-based learning? Question number 2. In your community, what are some of the skills that are outsourced? And how can young people be supported with the skills to provide that service? And question number 3. When was the last time you spoke to a young person about the practical challenges they face in entering the world of work? This was DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.